Well, for more on what to expect from the Beijing Games, I'm joined by Mark Nagel. He's a professor of sport management at the University of South Carolina. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with Pyeongchang. What sort of impact is this year's Games expected to have on the South Korean economy?
Well, I think there's two ways to look at that. The first and simplistic way is to say, well, there's millions of dollars that came in because of all the athletes, because of all the construction, because of all the visitors that spent money while they were there. And so on a very simplistic level, you say, oh, there's hundreds of millions of dollars potentially in impact. But I think to get a true indication, you have to go back and look and see how much did they spend prior to the Olympics to build facilities, to change infrastructure, and so forth. And so to really know the final number of how much the true economic impact is, it's very difficult unless you do a systematic analysis.
Now, we know a lot of the businesses tend to make money, but to what extent do the Winter Olympics benefit everyday Koreans?
Probably not a whole lot unless you're in the general vicinity of where the games are. So if you're sitting somewhere that's 100 miles away from where the main events are, there's not going to be a ton of economic activity other than maybe some people that say, I'm going to go to the Olympic Games and I'm going to stick around and go see other parts of China for, other parts of Korea, for a couple days. So I don't know that the economic impact for the entire country is going to be large, but certainly the economic impact around the areas where the hotels, the restaurants, the businesses, and the venues are going to see a tremendous spike in attendance and a tremendous spike in money that's generating through the economy.
So which sort of companies and sectors get the biggest boost from the Games, and how can they really hone in on that to keep the revenue going once the crowds have gone?
Well, the biggest sectors are obviously anything related to tourism. So when you talk about housing tourists, when you talk about feeding tourists, when you talk about entertainment options, and that's always, your question is one that's very, very difficult to answer. And I think a lot of cities have found that the great long-term answer has not been good. If you go back and look at Athens, if you go back and look at some of the other Olympic sites over the last 20 years, they've wanted to generate not just short-term impact during the Games, but they've wanted to have a long-term lasting impact. I think the city of Barcelona has done a great job of using the Olympic Games back in 1992 to launch a tourism wave, but some of the other cities that have hosted the Olympic Games, both summer and winter, have not really gotten the long-term impact and the long-term change in tourism dollars that they had hoped.
So then, in terms of return on investment, given the pattern that we've seen with previous hosts of the Olympic Games, is it ever really worth it financially to host an Olympic Games?
If you can host it without having to spend billions of dollars on new facilities and infrastructure improvements, then it can definitely be a boost for the local economy and definitely worth it. The problem is most of the cities that end up hosting these things over the last 15, 20 years have had to have tremendous amounts of facilities that have been built. The IOC asked for not just facilities for all the events, but every facility needs to be state-of-the-art, needs to have great playing conditions, need to have luxury suites, needs to have press areas. And so when we talk about we need 30, 40, in some cases at Summer Games, it might be even bigger numbers of buildings for the athletes, for the press, for the officials, for the competition areas. It's a tremendous amount of infrastructure investment that a lot of cities are making, and it's very, very difficult unless you can sustain that afterwards to make the financial figures work.
So then, looking ahead to 2022 when Beijing hosts the Winter Games, the Winter Olympics, what are the expectations and how is the country preparing for this huge influx of visitors?
Well, I think Beijing has one advantage in that they have, as you pointed out, they've hosted the Summer Games fairly recently. So they have a lot of buildings that they're already built. They have a lot of infrastructure in place to move the tens of, not hundreds of thousands of people that descend upon the Olympic areas. So they have that advantage. I think the disadvantage is going to be what we saw at the previous Beijing Games, which is a lot of the venues that they were using before for the Games in the summer in 2008 have mostly sat idle. And so what they need to try to do is generate a way to get people to come back to Beijing, to come back to the areas in the remote outskirts of Beijing where they're going to host the skiing and other outdoor events. They need to figure out a way to get people to come back 6 months, a year, 2 years, 10 years after the Games have concluded. And even some of the more popular Summer Olympic sites have not been able to do that. You look at what's happened in Athens with the decaying number of facilities that are no longer used and in fact have become abandoned. And so that's the big trick I think that China is going to have with Beijing in the Winter Olympics, is trying to do a better job of having a use for a lot of these facilities after the Olympics have left.
Sustainability certainly the key. Thank you so much. Mark Nagel there, Professor of Sports Management at the University of South Carolina.